Folklore staach a chuide chu go Blúiríní Beilidis, podchéile a chud cnúsach fi is air with a tíochtugh ó Críolóir na Chaisteanna and so Gloucester Holscoile Blúiríní. You're welcome along to Blúiríní Beilidis number 21, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection here at University College Dublin, with myself, Jonny Dillon. Now, listeners to previous episodes of the podcast will note the absence of one certain Claire, for the sake of completeness, doing, who's gone on recently to embark on a new adventure, but here to keep me on the straight and narrow and to ensure I don't end up incanting an incoherent dirge into the microphone here, to minimise the same, is a great friend of the National Folklore Collections and someone I'm delighted to have come and share his knowledge with us, and that is namely Billy McGlynn. And Billy taught me here in the Department of Folklore back when I first started studying here in 2007, and actually Billy was the first person to show me the manuscripts here, I remember, and he completed his PhD in folklore in 2013. I'm looking at your PhD beside me on the desk here, really getting vertigo looking at the thing. And
there's a lot of it there, all right.
There is, yeah, and that was published in 2016 under the FF Communications Journal's Folklore Fellows, which is an amazing series to be part of, as Blood Rite, the Feast of St. Martin in Ireland. And I saw a copy of that online for sale. I don't know if you've looked, Billy, but they're for sale for a good couple of £100, outdoing the handbook itself. So someone was either trying to get a new patio built onto their gaff or an attic conversion or something like that. But an amazing.
Well, it's not me anyway, John.
Yeah, amazing book. Billy, you works in television and media. You have a background in archaeology as well. And we'll talk more about that, I suppose. And more recently, you started working as a celebrant for the Humanist Association of Ireland. So delighted to have you on to Blúiríní and to kind of, I suppose, to mark the beginning of a new series. And maybe just, I suppose, for anyone listening in, maybe just to give them a bit of a background about yourself, about maybe how you even got interested in folk tradition or folklore in the first place.
Okay. Well, let me start off by saying what a great pleasure it is for me to be on this wonderful series. I've been listening to it since the start, so delighted. This is a wonderful thing to be part of. So thank you very much.
So my own story, I started off many years ago in art college, and I was supposed to be up in the studio drawing and making sculpture and things like that, and I found myself down in the library instead reading books. So after a year of that, I kind of stopped kidding myself and I went to Dublin and I did an arts degree in UCD. And folklore was not a first year subject at that point, so I did Celtic civilizations in first year, but I also did archaeology. And then I went to a wonderful lecture by the late Dahi O'Hogan, who came to the archaeology department to teach us about folklore and the possibility of doing it in second and third year. And as soon as I heard that, I was hooked. So the rest was written. I did my degree there in archaeology and folklore, and then I took some time off and came back and, like you say, completed my PhD there on the topic of the Feast of St. Martin in Ireland. And I found that just a really fascinating subject because of how strange the customs and practices associated with that feast day are. And it was something that intrigued me. So I pursued it to as deep a level as I could, I suppose. And then I had the very great fortune of being able to publish it afterwards. So
delighted. It's amazing that Dahi was such an inspiration for the two of us, I suppose. I was the same.
Absolutely.
His lectures were incredible. But yeah, I suppose it kind of fits as well as we consider, I suppose, those who have gone before us, even in the context of this episode. So I'll move, I suppose, on to just to discuss maybe the topic under consideration for this edition of Blúiríní, that we're basically going to look at a feast date which has an enormous amount of, I suppose, imaginative power and symbolic resonance to it, as well as an enormous corpus of kind of custom, belief and practice pertaining to it, that while still rooted in antiquity, it forms a kind of vibrant hinge point or an access point on the traditional calendar year to this day. And so we're going to discuss one of the big quarter days, so-called, in folk tradition, namely the festival of Samhain or Halloween, which is a time, I suppose, when the harvest having been kind of gathered in, the fields kind of fallow and bare, kind of colder, wetter weather setting in, and life would kind of turn inward again. So I suppose we're going to look at maybe some of the themes that arise, start as a rough kind of outline to how we'll kind of follow the conversation over the next while. We'll start maybe with some of the early literature before looking at more recent celebrations and ways that the custom was marked. And then it's also worth noting that there'll be some music throughout the course of this episode. So from two groups that I very much enjoy. One, Halo Manash from Finland, and another one, Agast from Norway. Two countries actually which had a lot to do with the study of and the I suppose, the analysis of folk tradition in Ireland and further afield in Europe. So, and then to close, we'll have a little piece that I suppose Biddy, myself and yourself have kind of half composed in a way. But yes, more anon. So to start, maybe, one thing you'd be able to clear up for me that I wouldn't have much of a sense of would be the archaeological record and sound. And is there much of do we see much in that regard?
It's very difficult to say. Something like a feast day or a festival is going to be an impossible thing to detect archaeologically, I think. What you can see perhaps is at great assembly sites that there were particular events, I think, where people gathered together. And there's traditions, there's things in folk literature and in the manuscript traditions of medieval Ireland which talk about great assemblies happening at Samhain. At places like Tara and at Awanmacha and those kind of great ritual centres that we know date from the Iron Age. Now, whether this was medieval monks and people composing literature and sort of situating it in what was to them a fictional historical past, or whether they're describing memories of ancient events, again, it's difficult to say. So tying in literature with archaeology is probably something that, in a general sense, you can do, but to say they were definitely here around the Feast of Samhain is something trickier to be able to conclusively prove. But I think the balance of probability is that these sites were places of assembly, and we know that there was, the likelihood, I think, is that these high holy days, these feast days, these days of people coming together, I think they probably did.
There's Fraser, the Golden Bough, which was a bit of crack book I remember loved reading back in the day. There's a piece that he mentions about Halloween and bonfires, but the kind of the division of the year, I suppose, which it'd be worth looking at before going back just to the point of archaeology and some of the early literature. I'll just read this out if you don't mind. Right, this is a piece from his text, talking about the division of the year, and he says, "From the foregoing survey, we may infer that among the heathen forefathers of European peoples, the most popular and widespread fire festival of the year was the great celebration of Midsummer Eve or Midsummer Day. The coincidence of the festival with the summer solstice can hardly be accidental. Rather, we must suppose that our pagan ancestors purposely timed the ceremony of a fire on earth to coincide with the arrival of the sun at the highest point of his course in the sky. If that was so, it follows the old founders of the midsummer rites had observed the solstices or turning points of the sun's apparent path in the sky, that they accordingly regulated their festal calendar to some extent by astronomical considerations. But while this may be regarded as fairly certain for what we may call the Aborigines throughout a large part of the continent, it appears not to have been true of the Celtic peoples who inhabited the land's end of Europe, the islands and promontories that stretch out into the Atlantic Ocean on the northwest. The principal fire festivals of the Celts, which have survived though in a restricted area with diminished pomp to modern times and even to our own day, were seemingly timed without any reference to the position of the sun in the heaven. They were 2 in number and fell at an interval of 6 months, one being celebrated on the eve of May Day and the other on All Hallow Eve, or Halloween as is now commonly called, that is the 31st of October. So there's, I suppose, the something that you had written in an article about this twofold division of the year.
Yeah.
But that seems not to have been related to either crops or the bringing in of crops, but and nor as to the solstice say, but there was a division of the light half of the year, the darker half of the year, and that may have related to kind of cattle, is what Fraser is suggesting, I suppose, in that text, that it was a part of the herdsman's year.
Yeah, I don't often agree with Fraser on a whole lot of things, but this is definitely one I think that he was correct on, and that this is the pastoral year. This is for people who are grazing herds. And, perhaps he was being general when he talked about Celts, but it's certainly the case for the Gaels and perhaps the prehistoric Irish as well, that the year was divided into 2. I think that it is perhaps an inheritance of the Indo-Europeans, and really you're talking about a pastoral people who would drive the cattle to the upland, using transhumance, this idea of grazing the cattle in an upland during the summer and then bringing them closer to the farm for the winter. So we see around the time, around the turning point from spring into summer and around the turning point from autumn into winter, we see the movement of cattle, the protection of cattle, these themes becoming important. And both of those transition points from winter to summer and summer to winter, we see them as being very important in a mythological sense. There's a lot of stories, supernatural activities happening around this time. And there's this very keen sense in a lot of Irish tradition, even to modern times, the correct time for storytelling would be from Samhain to Bealtaine. So we kind of have the light and dark half of the year divided up, and these turning points are the vital ones. And because they are transition points, these liminal points are threshold points in the year, I think they attract a lot of ideas to do with the supernatural, to do with having ritual or ceremonial importance to them.
There's a note we have here, we're talking about assemblies and fairs, and you'd mentioned in the early literature, but how it's so difficult, you can't really, it's hard to kind of connect that to the archaeological record. But there's a piece again in Keating's History of Ireland about the Feis of Tara, and he describes it here at Samhain. He says, now the Feis of Tara was a great general assembly like a parliament, in which the nobles and the ullas of Ireland used to meet at Tara every third year at Samhain, where they were wont to lay down and to renew rules and laws and to approve the annals and records of Ireland. There too it was arranged that each of the nobles of Ireland should have a seat according to his rank and title. There also a seat was arranged for every leader that commanded the soldiery who were in the service of the kings and the lords of Ireland. It was also the custom at the Feis of Tara to put to death anyone who committed violence or robbery, who struck another or who assaulted another with arms, while neither the king himself nor anyone else had power to pardon him such a deed. It was also their custom to pass 6 days in feasting together before the sitting of the assembly, namely 3 days before Samhain and 3 days after it, making peace and entering into friendly alliances with each other. And then a poem is kind of given on that describes some of the kind of practices. But there's also mentioned in Keating's, in the History of Ireland, about Clachga and then the fires that were there.
We know that Clachga, this place, or sometimes referred to in English as the Hill of Ward, this place that was supposedly the centre of great ceremony and ritual at Samhain, that it definitely was a ceremonial or a ritual centre from probably at least the Middle Bronze Age. And activity there seems to have persisted until perhaps the 5th century, I think maybe late 4th, early 5th century. Recent excavations have shown that the site was quite an extensive and much bigger than we thought archaeological complex. So, there's probably some grain of truth to it, but the precise details, this notion of, promulgating laws and passing judgments and all of this kind of stuff, who knows? Perhaps. I think those events, those kinds of events would probably take place as part of any sort of complex society, and there's no reason to think that Iron Age society was would be an exception to that. But whether it specifically was at that particular time, at that particular place, who knows? It's always hazardous to try and reconstruct based on these fragments that we have, but nevertheless, it's better than nothing. So, the jury's out, I think, until we find an inscription or a much more solid piece of information, saying what time of year, what it is. Sometimes they can tell from the age of the cattle or the pigs that were slaughtered on site whether these were autumn festivals or spring festivals. And there is in some of these ritual sites a tendency towards autumn as being perhaps the time when they were slaughtering animals. But that is the natural time of year to be slaughtering animals anyway. So I suppose we can talk about that later. But
and what about the I remember Dahi talking about in his lectures using the word sound coming from an older word meaning half. Usually the word sound is meant to define or to describe as summer's end, I've read.
Yeah, there's a couple of competing, I think, etymologies. The two that stand out to me, I think, are this notion that it perhaps comes from Samanos or Samonios, something like this, an old Proto-Celtic word. But another one that I have heard posited is that it perhaps come from a word which means assembly, so that it was this notion of great assemblies are coming together. Again, in the absence of definitive proof, we can only sort of look at the best likelihoods, but both seem to fit the pattern, so it could be either or perhaps it was a wordplay on both.
We need bold assertions, bold, unfounded assertions.
This is it. This is what we deal in the absence of good evidence.
Yeah.
We do our best.
I want to move forward to some of the kind of more recent examples in folk tradition, and I suppose into to look at maybe what would become slightly more, maybe a bit more familiar to people when they consider Halloween or Icha Hauna, and to look, I suppose, at first and foremost the names in folk tradition by which the festival was known. It had a couple of different names in Irish and in English, didn't it?
Yeah, we see Samhain being the most obvious one in Irish, or Ihe Hauna, and Halloween in English, which relates it obviously to the festival of All Hallows, the evening before All Hallows. But other names you see would be Ihe na Hamaléshe, which is the night of mischief, or Ihe na Glas, the night of tricks. And I think it's still very much known in Irish as Ihe na Hamaléshe down in the southeast of the country, around Ring, where they still speak Irish in the Gaeltacht there, that it would be known very much for that. And I remember tutoring actually students when the folklore began to be offered as a first year subject, and we had quite a big intake of students, and we were tutoring them, and the students from the Waterford, Wexford area had this very strong sense of mischief and games, and the real old traditional ones like pulling cabbages and moving gates and things like that.
As if we'd planned it, I have a recording here from that I got out of the archive, the sound archive, a tape from Jim Delaney, and he's collecting. This is from Michael Walsh, and he's collected this in February 1982, and he's describing the tricks that are played on Halloween night. I'll play this now, Billy. Hopefully you can hear it. But he's talking about this, like you'd mentioned there, apart from the pulling of cabbages, the stealing of gates, and often how kind of particularly cantankerous sorts or curmudgeonly sorts who wouldn't take it well in the community, they're the ones who'd be targeted. So this is Mick Walsh.
Well, then, after they take, as generally old crass lads, they take their gates and they'll throw them into a drain. They'll be on next day looking for them, and they'll take a barn door off of a cow house, or off of a barn, or a door off of a cow house, and they'll carry them off, and they'll go and they'll take that man's one or two of his gates, or little wicket gates, or doors, and they'll take them off somewhere else. And they'll be going around nearly all night.
That was, he's basically describing how they'd take their gates, they'd throw them in a drain, or they'd take a barn door off a cow house, or they'd kind of carry them off, and they'd take off two of his gates, and they'd be kind of going around all night doing that. So this aspect of mischief is I suppose it's a central part that we find in lots of the practices around at Halloween.
It is, and I have to admit that I remember when we were younger, growing up in Limerick, often on Halloween night going out in disguise, or semi-disguise at least, and causing mischief, throwing eggs. And I suppose because we lived in a town as well, we were under probably no small influence from the more urban form of Halloween, which involved fireworks and bangers and smoke bombs. To be honest, I think that comes from the Guy Fawkes tradition, but which is in early November as well. But nevertheless, we used them to cause our own little bit of mischief and tricks. And this notion of picking on cantankerous members of the community, I think there were a couple of houses which were always subject to a bit more
rigorous
from
pursuits.
The mischievous children. Yeah, absolutely. But it's a complex set of ideas, I think. Perhaps, the idea behind this is that there is license given on this night. As, again, I suppose it's this old anthropologist, archaeologist and folklorist concept that we'll probably keep returning to, of liminality, when we are in a time of change, moving from summer to winter, that the normal rules of reality tend to break down a little bit. And I think there is a social license given. People are allowed to break the rules a little bit. People know that their children are probably going out and getting up to a bit of mischief, but because the normal rules of reality are suspended.
As long as everything is sort of brought back to normal the next day, then
it's
let the children have their fun.
Yeah, it's a funny it's an interesting part of kind of calendar custom observances, like you said, where you have the rules are kind of broken, but not in a totally disordered or chaotic way. They're kind of broken in order to, reaffirm the ties that bind, in a sense that there's a breakdown in a controlled way, or a suspension is a better way to put it, that then kind of resumes after the thing is done. But there's another point I was chatting earlier on about. There's a tension sometimes that you see between expressions of kind of around calendar customs, say, or of folk traditions, and then say there will be a kind of negative response from the authorities, from the state, say, where there's often a lot of maybe complaints that are made around Halloween, fires being lit, or antisocial behaviour or whatever. And there's a certain kind of a tension sometimes between the authorities and then these traditional practices, in the same way that you would have seen with maybe the church trying to put down certain kind of customs and pattern days and things throughout the year, that there's a certain unruly element to it, you know.
Well, there is, and I'm part of it. I think is, you know, rebellion. People will rebel against authority, and this tension that you find between official Ireland as it is, and what people actually get up to and what people want to get up to. But I do think it's part of that, like you said, and it's a good way of putting it, about controlling it. So it's like a pressure valve. If children have to obey, if young people have to constantly be subject to the restrictions of the society that they live in, if they're given license to misbehave in this particular way, I think it's perhaps it's healthy. It's because it you know, you're given a short window in which to break the rules. People expect it. People know that it's coming, and then things return to normal, and perhaps the rules return to normal stronger than ever after the tension has been sort of let off.
You kind of brush against the guardrails or whatever.
I think so. I think that's probably what's going on a psychological level, or certainly in society. And
the other kind of, I suppose, the most familiar aspects again that we see at this time and other parts throughout the calendar year is disguise. The idea of disguise, of dressing up. Sometimes men dressing up in women's clothing, women dressing up in men's clothing, and then children dressing up as kind of characters, or, you know, the dead or ghosts, whatever. But that's another particularly common part of this tradition.
It is. It's one of the most distinctive features of Halloween. But of course, we don't find it at Halloween alone. We find it on other festival days as well. On St. Bridget's Day, you have biddy boys. You had, in certain places, you had May Day customs where people would dress up in straw or in goatskin masks, that kind of thing. Straw boys at weddings, all of that kind of stuff. But I suppose it's at its most obvious, and it's at its most popular at Halloween, and it's something that really persists nowadays. And it's been interesting to watch the evolution of it in the last while, because certainly when we were kids, it was always about dressing up as scary things, supernatural things. There was a strong supernatural bent to everything. But as time goes on, you see people dressing up more as sort of hero figures, or you see, you know, characters from a movie, people dressed as, you know, positive and happy kind of figures as well as scary ones. So it is changing. It's constantly changing over time. But traditional ones, I think it was primarily disguise. Whether it was scary or not, one had to be disguised. And I think that was an important part of it. I'm not sure what the origin of it is, specifically relating to Halloween, whether it comes from this very prevalent notion, this very strong idea in Halloween that the supernatural world, in whatever way it manifests, is close to our world, and the two overlap substantially on that night. There's this overwhelming sense that otherworld figures can intrude into our world, that perhaps the dead are active at this time, and maybe it comes from this idea that people would dress up like them in order to walk amongst them, or perhaps it comes from more medieval ideas to do with praying for the dead, going around from house to house, sort of offering to pray for the dead in return for money or for rewards of that kind of thing. Maybe it was a complex evolution of a lot of these different things, but it's still very much evolving, and it's still very much something in play. And what you see, an interesting twist on that now as well, of course, is adults dressing up, people going to Halloween parties and nightclubs holding events and things like that where people will dress up. So it's gone from what, it's certainly in my youth, it was primarily children who did it, going into adults. But of course, if you go back through the folklore archives as well, there are accounts of youths and adults going around dressing up. So it's something that's constantly changing and evolving, I think.
There's a piece here from the Urban Folklore Project, a recording it was made in Knockmitten. The Urban Folklore Project was a scheme that the department put together in 1979, 1980. But it describes that it's Seamus McPhilip is the collector, and he's asking this family, you know, what used to happen at Halloween. And actually, it's kind of a collector's nightmare as far as transcribing a scenario goes. Where there's two sisters and a brother, and they're all in this. It's just this one excerpt, but they're all kind of clamoring over each other to give their point, which renders the tape kind of hard to pick apart. But in this part, they're talking about it was an adult affair, and it was men dressing as women, and then women dressing as men, and they're out and praying tunes and so on.
And Halloween out here was a fantastic time.
Oh, you go on at Halloween?
Oh, it was marvellous out here. The women had all dressed up as men, you know, in the old country yorks and blackface caps, pipes.
And
Went to
go
the
all
local
around
pubs, you know, where there was only light, not electric light, gas light, lamp light. And the people were men, and then you'd end up out on the bridge with somebody playing the melodeon and dancing. And, fantastic. Around all the houses.
They'd be grown up too.
Oh, yes.
Dress
Yes.
up.
Gosh, even the older men, we used to dress them up as women and stuff them out and put furs on them, wigs on them.
Yeah.
You know, and bring all go around. Fantastic.
So yeah, she described how they used to stuff furs and wigs on even the old men and send them out. But this is, I suppose, part of this idea of disguise seems to, I mean, you see it in, like you mentioned, lots of the quarter day traditions or other social events, the straw boys, and it's again kind of breaking the rules that normally apply. You know, you're calling around from house to house, making demands of people while masked.
Yeah. And this notion, I mean, it's ritual transvestism, if you want to give it a label. It's, you know, cross-dressing in this way. Again, I think there's a deliberate sense of violating normal, probably quite restrictive rules of dress and identity and things like that. And I think it adds to the overall idea of chaos and fun and mischief and rule break.
Yeah. And I remember reading an article in Shincher years ago about Halloween on Inishmaan. It's describing adults going around from house to house.
Yes, and I think I certainly remember seeing archive footage from RTE of in the Aran Islands people dressing up, and as far as I know, they still do that to this day, where the adults will get together, they'll go to the pub, but they'll be dressed head to foot in disguise, and they'll disguise even their hands, their voices. No part of them will be identifiable. And Padraig Clancy, I think, maybe has done some work in this area, but it seems to be very much something that is, I won't say taken seriously because it's obviously done in fun, but they do it in a very dedicated and comprehensive kind of way. So you know, they do it well there anyway, for sure. And it's not just children by any means. It's very much an adult affair.
So there's kind of, I guess, misbehaving, there's disguise, reversal of normal reference points generally. But something you mentioned earlier, which at all kind of, we can file all of this under the idea of liminality, is this idea of the supernatural and the boundaries between the other world and this world kind of fading away or disappearing for this certain period of time, which is a strange, it's a strange kind of notion to consider in a, how would you say it, in a traditional sense, that all periods of time are not the same. You know, all moments are not equal in a traditional view. In the same sense, all space is not equal. There are ritual spaces, supernatural places, dangerous places, but only at certain times. So at dawn, at dusk, and then at this as this major kind of hinge at the beginning of the dark part of the year. There's a heavy kind of, I suppose, consideration given to death and to the other world, or the spirits of the other world around us, the fairy host and so on.
And was it supposed to be unlucky to interfere with where they lived, was it?
They couldn't go next door near it. Because my father's mother built a pigsty here at the back of that wall. There. There. And we used to have a couple of sows, pigging. As Smith has said, don't build the pigsty there, at the back of that wall. And boy, the fairies goes by that way. It's only once a year though. How was that?
What time is that? What time of the year?
So when does the fairies come? There's a Halloween. Halloween. Or Halloween. And we had to open a little, there's a path. Wherever they're going, no one ever knew. Because they were gone now forever. And remember the man that built it, he left a little approachable window. He was out there.
Just out here.
And let them go through into Knockmitten.
It's something, again, when we look at early records and mythological tradition, mythological tradition is quite consistent in this view that the other world and our world are imminent at this time. And it says things like the she, this overarching concept that the Irish have of this other world that they refer to as the she, that there's nothing that could happen in these sheave mounds that was not visible on Samhain, because it was believed that the portals were open, these particular places in the landscape that had supernatural association. And again, very often archaeological places like Newgrange or Slieve na Mán, or these old burial tombs, that these were considered transition points between our world and this nebulous concept of the other world, and that they were open. There are lots of stories. There's stories from the Fenian tradition which talks about Alain the Burner, who was a figure.
Burn down the fort every sound.
Yeah, he used to come to Tara and burn it down, and Fionn McCool used various magical machinations in order to stay awake while he chanted a sleep music. And then he slaughtered Alain, and this was the thing that propelled him into sort of true hero status, and he became the leader of the Fianna. But another great story from Halloween as well, from Samhain, set at Samhain, is the Achtra Nera, the Adventure of Nera. And again, it talks about this great warrior from Rathcrohan who had to go out and tie a spancel around the foot of a corpse that had been hanged from the gallows. And the other warriors were too afraid to do it because of this supernatural beings that were emerging and coming out and frightening them all. He manages to do it. He ties a spancel around the corpse's leg, and then they go off on an adventure. The corpse can speak, of course. They have to go and get a drink of water. And the corpse, he causes the death of people in a nearby house.
Yeah, doesn't he say they come to one house and there's a happy couple in there, and they can't go in, and they come to another one, and they can go into a house where the couple are arguing, or they're praying in one, they can't go in there. Happiness in another, can't go in there. And there's one house, there's discord, and it's like, yeah, we'll stay the night here, and that's where.
Yeah, but it was they found a ring of fire around one of the houses, and they found a moat of water around the other of the houses. And this, I think it's to do with the idea of throwing out the ashes, that this would create a sort of protective barrier around the house, or throwing out dirty water. And these were things that I think people refrained from doing on Halloween. But it was the house that had no protection from this magical ring of fire or this magical moat of water that the corpse was able to go into, and he took a swig of water and spat the water out onto the people, and it killed them. But then they return. Nera has had enough of this killer corpse that he's carrying around on his back, so he brings it back to the gallows, and when he goes back he sees a supernatural army emerging from the other world, and they come and they attack the palace that he had just left. It's a convoluted story, and we won't go too far down the rabbit hole, but essentially he's seeing a vision of the future, and he ends up in the other world for quite a long period of time. But when he returns from the other world to this world, only a short period of time has passed. And this is something, I think, which speaks to the geography of the other world is quite strange. It doesn't work the same way as ours, and neither does timekeeping in the other world. We've seen it in the story of Oisin and Tiernan Og. He spends a short amount of time there and hundreds of years have passed. And we see almost the opposite in the Adventure of Nera, where he goes for what seems like quite a long period of time, and only a short period of time has passed. But he brings spring flowers with him. He brings primrose and golden fern and wild garlic, which will only grow in the spring and summer. And he brings these back as proof that he has been to this otherworld residence. And so space, time, all of these things are in flux, and I think the drawing this clear boundary between the world of mortals and the world of, whether it was the world of the dead or the world of whatever the Sidhe represent. Are they the old gods? Are they supernatural beings? Are they some complex combination of all of these? It seems that they were, as you know, the Irish are always trying to, all the way through the medieval period and into modern times, are trying to wrap their head around what is this community, this supernatural community. Sometimes they look like the dead, sometimes they look like the old gods, sometimes they look like spirits of the land. So people are always trying to work it out and figure it out. But one thing that's fairly consistent is that whatever they are and whatever they represent, they're active at Samhain, and you would do well to steer clear of them and not get in their way. Otherwise, great mischief and trouble can befall you.
There's something you mentioned there about the ashes of fire and water and kind of the preparation of the house on this night with this kind of otherworld interference. I want to play another piece from Patrick Johnson from near Moat in County Westmeath. This is again a tape recording with the archive here from Jim Delaney, and he's interviewing in 1964. He's interviewing Patsy Johnson, who's 82 at that time, but he's talking at this about Patsy describing his father putting great kind of importance on getting the house ready on this night, cleaning it up, getting clean water down, and not being allowed to throw out the ashes. So I'll play this here if you know.
But did you ever hear your father talking about people getting the house ready and cleaning it up, not raking the fire?
I did.
That night?
I did.
Or the night before that?
It was the Hullantide night.
Yeah.
And everyone that time would have clean water put in.
Yeah.
A bucket of clean water. And the next, I says, what did they want with it? He'd say, any water in tonight? No, well it has to be in for tonight. And I say, what are you talking about, the clean water? What has to be in for? Well, the good people is supposed to be in every house. They'll go round about and has a great time tonight. And often a child has to be baptized or washed. They want the water. And if it's not there, something in the house will be done, or a pig a day on you, or something.
I see.
But the water is supposed to be there for that night.
I see.
That's all now.
But what?
And you're not supposed to throw out dashes of 2 nights, November night and the night after. You're not supposed to throw out that for 3 or 4 days. And the cure that was in that thing, it'll kill lice. You put that ashes dry upon a base that have lice in them, it'll kill the lice.
I see.
That's all now I can know about that.
So in that tape he's describing, the sense that the fairies come into the house in that night, that they have a great time, but that the house needs to be in good order and that the water has to be clean. But he mentions then that you're not supposed to throw out the ashes for 3 or 4 days. And he describes it. He says there was a cure that would kill lice, that you'd put the dry ashes upon a beast and a farm animal that would have lice on them, and it would kill the lice. So there's the kind of secondary uses of these ordinary objects, but only at specific times. You can't go kind of rubbing ashes on your cat on a Tuesday in January or whatever. It has to be at this specific time, this specific day. And another point that you'd mentioned about this reference to kind of the borders, the boundaries between this world and the other world being suspended, and again in whatever sense that is, because there's so many complex variations about it in tradition. There's a piece here from, we have these wonderful questionnaires that the Folklore Commission sent out in 1943 on the topic of Halloween and Samhain, and so the questionnaire system was a way for people listening who aren't familiar of collecting traditions and practices regarding certain aspects of folk tradition via a postal system, basically based on a Swedish system, where that's how they carried out an enormous amount of their collections, where detailed questionnaires would be drawn up and distributed around the country, and then the returns would all be kind of bound, paginated and catalogued and so on. And this is a piece from Westmeath, and it's talking about the fairies, and it says here, yes, the fairies are supposed to be around on Holly Eve night, but the only local places that I know to be associated with them are Clonlon and Castle, and some hill near a fort on the west side of Knockadowny. Here it is said by the locals that the sweetest of music may be heard on each succeeding Holly Eve night. The castle ruin is about 1.5 miles southwest of Moat. The fort on the western side of Knockdowney is also said to have been a residence of the O'Mallachlins. In fact, King Malachy is said to have lived here, and a cave there, which is still called King Malachy's Cave. Here again, sweet music is to be heard on Holly Eve night, while in a hilly field to the east, locally called the Silver Hill, the fairies are said to play their football matches, and one may hear the shouts and hear the football hopping, and not alone on Holly Eve, but any evening at all. So there are these kind of, you'll find references that up and down the country all over the place, that the fairies are moving from their summer quarters to their winter quarters, and like you were saying, Biddy, that you need to take extra care at this time to protect yourself, basically.
Yeah, and it's what I think again speaks to this ambiguity and how people are constantly struggling with this idea is that some communities and some traditional accounts of Halloween, they're unambiguous and they say that it's the dead, it's the spirits of the dead that return on Halloween, or the day after Halloween, the night after Halloween. And then others talk about it being the fairies. So tradition has never really made its mind up about who or what either of those communities are precisely supposed to be. So in some places you'll see the fairies coming into the house and sitting down and eating food, and then in other places, particularly on the eve of the Feast of All Souls rather than All Saints, which is the 1st of November, people would leave out food for the dead. They would leave the door on the latch, and they genuinely believed in this, not in a scary way or not in a threatening way, that the dead would return. And for them, I think the idea seems to be that this was a way of making loved ones feel that they're not forgotten and that people still remember them. And it was a way, I think, of easing the transition of souls into the other world, that if they came back to check, say, yes, we still remember you, we still respect you, and this perhaps allowed people to transition into the other world. But, again, these ideas people are working them out over time and working them out over space. Certain parts of Ireland is very. But, part of that as well, I think, is to do with the history of Halloween as a festival. Samhain is almost certainly quite old. It's almost certainly prehistoric in origin. But we see the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls, which are the 1st and 2nd of November, and, the night before being the 31st and the 1st, that these were not originally situated at that time of year, and that they were moved in the medieval period. Whether it's coincidence or not, I don't think it was coincidence that they were moved to coincide with these very important, this pre-existing festival that was quite important. But again, it speaks to the evolution of something that's changing over time as well. And there's an awful lot of Christian tradition to do with the dead and visiting the dead and praying for the souls of the dead as well. But when purgatory was a concern of people, that they would pray for the souls of the dead in the other world, to get them from purgatory into heaven. So this adds to this numinous sense, the sense that there's something else active around this time. And whether the dead were originally associated with prehistoric Samhain, or whether it was just whatever the fairies represent or not, it's hard to say, but it's a complex set of ideas that have fallen together and given us this very rich traditions of what modern Halloween is now.
Yeah. I want to just read another piece just from what you're describing there, from the it fits in what you were saying there. This is again from the Halloween questionnaires here in the archives in the folklore collection. This is a piece from County Clare, and just on that topic, it says, deceased relatives were said to have visited their own homes on All Souls Night. Older people were supposed to leave a pipe filled with tobacco and some matches nearby for the old head of the house on his return from eternity. The fire was scarcely slacked at all, and the door left on the latch. So there's a kind of symbolic welcoming, preparing the table, preparing the house, leaving the windows open sometimes, leaving the doors open. Which again, I suppose it's just that's strange, that kind of complex ideas about a sense of transition and things moving around at this time, basically, but in a kind of strange, slightly supernatural way.
Yeah. But it's interesting to see people sort of making their peace with that. They're aware that the dead are coming in, and they make space for that in their home, and they accommodate that in their belief systems. And it seems to be a respectful, quiet kind of affair, that the dead should be made welcome in this way.
there's to kind of consider another aspect of that one of the characteristics of the feast. And we talked about some of the tricks and kind of mischief that people would get up to, but there was also, again, on account of the liminality, maybe that this isn't something that you can do on a Tuesday in January type thing. But the idea of divination on this night, that the again with things in a state of flux, that you could look to certain ordinary household objects, but that they'd be imbued on this evening with a kind of secondary purpose that could maybe fill you in on what was due to happen to you throughout the year.
Yeah, I think so. And again, one would wonder, is the notion of divination, does this stretch back to the ancient customs of Halloween, whether people believe that knowledge or ideas or information could be gleaned from supernatural sources because they were close to our world? Or is there a more mundane origin for that really, making predictions on the first day of winter, how is the rest of this festival going, or how this season going to go? So maybe just by virtue of the fact that it was a turning point, that people wanted to make predictions. But whatever the origin of it, it's certainly something that's very widespread. I know we practiced it growing up as well, playing Halloween games and divination games, and the archives and the accounts of Halloween in recent centuries are very consistent with this idea that people believed that they could see into the future at this time, that they could tell who people were going to marry, or that they could tell what the weather was going to be like for the rest of the season. And like I said, we played some divination games as well with the skins of apples and pouring wax into water to make shapes, to see that these shapes indicate what somebody was going to do in the future. The games that, where you lay out saucers with water and soil and things like that, these are all games that we played as well growing up. So there's a lot to it, and you find it in most parts of Ireland, this notion of divination.
There's another a recording here from Stahio Hogan, and he's recording from his mother, and he's asking her about kind of some of the customs around at this time concerning divination, but she mentions burning of nuts, that they'd be placed in the grate in the fire, and that if they each one would be named for a man and a woman, and if they jump beside each other, then those kind of sweethearts would be married, whatever. And if they'd burn on the spot, or if they jump away from each other, then they wouldn't marry. So I'll play that here.
What about Halloween then?
Halloween was much the same now, but I don't think they do it very much now. We'd have the apples, and to try and catch one hanging out of a string and trying to catch and that sort of thing. Then you'd have a saucer, you'd have clay on that, another saucer, you'd have water on it, another saucer, and you'd have a ring on it. Forget the rest of them. And you'd be blindfolded, each one would be blindfolded, and they'd go over whichever one they'd put their hand into. If you put your hand on the ring, you'd be married the first, and you put your hand on the water, you'd cross the sea. And if you put your hand in the clay, you'd die before the first. So, and that will go on the same. I think much the same happens now, but I don't think they do it so often now.
And something like in the forest or something?
No, that was Halloween too, I'd say. You'd have the hazelnuts. Yeah. And the grate, the bars of a grate, the big fires we used to have with the bars going across the grates. These, they were big ones with a hobbit each side. Well, you put a lot of little nuts along the bars there, you see. And you call one nut, you'd say that's Katie, if she was there, we'd say. Another one is Jonny's, another one is Paddy's and Lizzie's, and so on along. And the first one that would blow, with the heat of the fire, you see, it would make one move and hit the other, that sort of thing. And I can't remember now exactly what was the ending up of it, but they were supposed to get married. That was it. They were supposed to get married. If one hit the other, one this side hit a girl at the other side, and so on. They used to put them the way a man and a woman, and so on, like that. And that's the nuts.
So that was, again, just I suppose, a reference to the idea of this divination, basically, that like you're saying, we look to the future, or at this time, that what's in store for us in the year ahead is kind of can be revealed. Either who will you marry, or will you even be alive, which is useful to know. But there's there's so much you could kind of keep exploring with this, and it's hard to just, we're just kind of scratching the surface with it, but one of the things that you're an expert on, that I wanted to kind of to see how it links in as well to Halloween, is the festival, the eve of, or the feast of Saint Martin, on the 11th of November, and this is kind of a particularly strange feast date, really, or a festival that involves ritual sacrifice in the home, but seems to have been originally related to Samhain. Was it moved because of the Gregorian Julian calendar kind of thing, or what's happening there?
I don't think so. I think the move happened before that. The way in which St. Martin's Day was observed was by, like you said, ritual animal sacrifice. And the most common thing in recent centuries was people would shed the blood of fowl, a goose or a cockerel or something like that. And it was most often done on the doorstep of the house at sundown on the night before the Feast of St. Martin. So a threshold place at a threshold time. It's the theme keeps cropping up over and over again. But my research sort of pointed me towards the likelihood that this ceremonial or ritual slaughter of animals was probably something that took place at Samhain. And it was really, I think, with the coming of the Anglo-Norman regime, who would have had more devotion to St. Martin, or at least St. Martin's Day was an important economic as well as religious day for them. The Irish retained, I think, the notion of Samhain being the important feast day. This was the day when people would pay tribute to their lord when the taxes were due. And very often the way they did that was by slaughtering animals and giving the meat, paying tribute to their lord or to their king with meat. So when the Anglo-Normans came, we see the establishment of St. Martin's fairs, and these become the primary commercial and trading and events, I suppose, in the year, and also rent being due on St. Martin's Day rather than Samhain. The Anglo-Normans would not have observed Samhain, I don't think, as an economic day. It was more St. Martin's Day. So I think the ceremonial and the ritual elements that were probably once associated with Samhain, both St. Martin's Day and Samhain occur around the time of year when you're slaughtering animals anyway. The animals that have been feeding all summer and are not, you don't want to be feeding them fodder for the winter, or you don't think they're going to make it through the winter, or that they're ready for slaughter really at that time. So you're killing animals anyway. And I think it was something that originally occurred in the festival of Samhain and was moved in the medieval period for political reasons, for economic reasons. It moved to St. Martin's Day. One of the things you see in early literature is people feasting on pigs and fresh meat at Samhain. And of course, we'll know from the medieval period and from modern times that meat is absolutely not eaten at Samhain. People would eat barmbrack, they would eat mashed potatoes. So it's a day of abstinence, yeah. And that's not how it was originally. So I think the abstinence thing came in later, and particularly after this time when slaughter and feasting and the eating of fresh meat had already moved to St. Martin's Day. And it was really in that context, in St. Martin's Day context, that it continued on. And what you see is, like you said, everyday or mundane substances taking on particular significance. And the blood from the animals that were shed on St. Martin's Day, blood was normally consumed. People would eat the blood of a pig or eat the blood of a goose, but the blood that was shed on St. Martin's Day was a sacred substance. People used it to mark the doorstep. They would, in Galway, they would place blood on the foreheads of children in order to keep them safe for the year. So the blood went from being a mundane foodstuff into something of a sacred and a prophylactic substance. And I think what you also see at the other end of the year then is people would shed the blood of cattle at Blúiríní at the 1st of May. And again, this was done, for their health. They wouldn't slaughter them, but they would shed some of their blood at that time. And this was supposedly for their health. But there's an account of by William Wilde, and he talks about the great fort at Rathcrohan, where cattle had been gathered up together, and they would shed the blood on the ground at this place. And in some places, in some instances, they burnt the blood as well. So the blood in this case seems to be operating in the same way that it does at St. Martin's Day. And it kind of hints, I think, towards this dual part of the year, this two-part division of the year. Blood as a sacred substance at Blúiríní, blood as a sacred substance at Samhain, and then that transferring 10 days later to St. Martin's Day. And a very common expression that you find to do with St. Martin's Day as well is Nae Nithe agus Ihe gan Áirith ó Ihe Hauna go Féle Martin. So 9 nights and a night without counting, so 10 nights from Halloween to St. Martin's Day. So there was this very strong memory in tradition that St. Martin's Day and Halloween were linked, and that they moved it on 10 days, that the significance changed.
Is this Shan sound? You know that some people would reference Shan sound.
That, just to complicate matters further, there was another sort of 10-day jump in the calendar as well, which happened, like you alluded to earlier, from the moving from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. But I think the process of St. Martin's Day taking over from Samhain had well and truly, it had been in for centuries by the time that came in. But what you do see is certain places where St. Martin's Day was not historically observed. You see this notion of Shan Samhain, and this is particularly the case in Ulster, where St. Martin's Day traditions, for fairly complex historical reasons, they didn't survive into modern times, but and that is to do with the Julian and Gregorian calendar. So the memory of Old Halleve, as they called it, or Old Hallowtide, or Old Shanahan, that is where you find that sort of 10-day discrepancy. So it's kind of confusing, but I think it's primarily the Anglo-Normans who can put it down to them.
Yeah. What did the Romans ever do for us? I'm going to play a piece that brings this out, and then just it references again, collected by Jim Delaney. This is from Offaly, again from Michael Walsh, 1982, and he's describing sacrifices in honour of St. Martin.
We were talking, go ahead now, we were talking about St. Martin's Day.
Yeah, that's the 11th of November, isn't it?
Yeah. You said they're doing it still in the mountain.
Well,
killing the cock.
They would carry on, they do, and we done it here.
Yeah.
And done it a couple of years ago in here, you forgot.
Yeah. Well, what day would you do it?
And Dave, you see.
The Eve, was it?
Dave is St. Martin's Day, and isn't that the 11th of November, I think?
It is, that's right.
And there's no mill wheel will turn that day.
Yes.
There's no one will thrash. Because St. Martin was ground up in a mill on that day.
Yeah.
That was the martyrdom they gave him.
Yes.
Threw him in and was ground up into bits.
Yeah.
No mill wheel and turner, they wouldn't. They had, and I see a machine man coming up, and a Protestant machine man, Harry Hodgins, or don't know what's his name, I think he's dead since. I'd be doing the post. Well, it'll come on the day before November Day. Or before St. Martin's Day. There'd be no thrashing the next day. They wouldn't let anyone thrash. But that's died out now, I suppose. There's no thrashings now because it's thrashed in the field.
Yeah.
But the cock would be killed.
Yeah.
St. Martin's Eve, or a chicken, or two of the like. But generally one good cock. And the blood would be sprinkled on the doorsteps. Maybe, and I used to shaking the door and everything. Maybe brought in the gate around the house.
Did they do this? The stables?
Any of them that does it still.
Yeah. Do the
people.
Yeah.
I'll kill the cock St. Martin's Eve.
Yeah.
And I'll sprinkle it the doorstep. Well, that keeps away diseases and things like that.
Yeah.
You see,
that was what it's done for.
That's partly what it's done, honouring St. Martin and asking his intercession and killing the cock in his honour of God and in honour of him to intercede God and shaking the blood on the doorsteps. Wasn't it a great custom?
Yeah. Did they do the outside houses?
No, not that I know.
Yeah.
So some would, all right, some would. It protects man and base, but the house would do for all. Oh, because that's an old custom.
It is very.
Again, yeah.
So that's just a description of the kind of sacrifices being made in the house, like you mentioned, Billy, the kind of slaughter of animals, and that also no mill wheel would turn, and as he eloquently put, that Martin was kind of squashed to bits, and that was his martyrdom. And so in honour of that people refrain from turning wheels and things on that day. But it's an amazingly kind of complex landscape, I suppose, of ritual and imaginative kind of artistry and creativity and so on, with the whole Samhain festival, really.
It is, and it's not static. It has been ever evolving, and when you're talking about these really big concepts of life and death, and where do people go after they die, and the idea of the dead moving among us, and the cycle of the year. These are all the biggest questions that we have to answer, and it's no surprise, I think, that people are coming to grips with this in very different ways, and that would evolve and change according to society's perspectives on it and what society needs in a festival like this as well. And the modern commercialization of Halloween, for all the lamenting we might do about it, has actually offered a sort of a framework against which much older ideas and concepts and practices can still persist. So it sometimes surprises me about the Hollywoodization of Halloween and commercialization of Halloween. There's still some really old traditional gems that persist in it, and because it's such a complex and multifaceted thing, it's changing before our eyes. There's never one particular definition of what Halloween actually is or what Samhain actually is. It's something for the ages and something that continues to evolve and grow.
Thanks so much, Billy, for being with us. It's fantastic. Totally delighted, and we could kind of keep. There's so much to consider, but I hope it gives a bit of an overview, kind of brief, maybe just to point at some of the points of departure that we kind of, I suppose, see at this time at the festival. And to close, I'm going to finish. There's you sent me, Billy, some you are involved in kind of creations of these old Iron Age instruments, Bronze Age instruments, Iron Age instruments, am I?
Iron Age and both. I've made both, but this one is the one that I sent you was a replica of the Loch Ness Shade trumpet. This is a bronze musical instrument which was found beside the great temple at Awan Macha or Navanfort. It was one of 4 instruments that were found, so I recorded 4 tracks just to see what 4 of them would have sounded like together. And then I think you've woven your digital magic over that as well.
Lots of old analog synthesizers that have put over it.
Yeah, but who knows, perhaps this kind of music or these sounds accompanied the old sound festivals or observances, sacrifices. Who knows what they were getting up to at Awan Macha way back in the distant past. Whether it is or not, it's nice to indulge in the imagination, particularly at this time of year as well.
Agreed. And so I'm going to play a piece from bits of my synthesizers over the recording that you've done. And just before we go, then, just to say thank you so much for coming along and chatting to us this evening. And then where can people kind of find more about your own work, and what are you doing for Halloween?
Oh, good question. I have a website which is tradition.ie, and if people are interested, they can sort of keep up with the various different bits and pieces that I'm up to there. But I suppose part of I suppose that I started off in art college, and I don't think I ever left art college in my mind in certain respects. So I like to combine art and performance along with my academic studies and my unending interest in folklore. So part of that project is devising these sort of ceremonies, if you want to call them that, or great assemblies at some of these festival times of the year at Bealtaine and at Samhain. So we'll be having a big party in Dolan's in Limerick on Halloween night. We're calling it a pagan rave. So if there's more information about that available on the website, if people are interested, it's a sort of an ongoing investigation into the intersecting of art and performance and folklore and history, but it's very much something new. So,
but it's part of the what's so enjoyable is the creative kind of reinterpretation and interpretation of living tradition and using it as an imaginative force.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I'll put a link in the SoundCloud description for people if they want to see more about Billy's site. And but yeah, just to say thanks again, thanks so much, and to hope that people out there enjoyed, and hopefully you'll come on again and chat to us and talk more.
Thank you, Jonny. All right,
Mag Fhloinn.